Good morning, Team Alabama. We have a little more of Hatchet today. Please join me on your Chromebooks on page 56. He had to stop. His mouth was full of saliva and his stomach was twisting and growling. What was that there to eat? What had he read or seen that told him about food in the wilderness? Hadn't there been something? A show, yes. A show on television about Air Force pilots and some kind of course they took. A survival course. All right. He had the show coming into his thoughts now. The pilots had to live in the desert, and they put them in the desert down in Arizona or someplace, and they had to live for a week. They had to find food and water for a week. For water, they had made a sheet of plastic into a dew-gathering device, and for food, they ate lizards. That was it. Of course, Brian had lots of water. There weren't too many lizards in the Canadian woods that he knew. One of the pilots had used a watch crystal as a magnifying glass to focus the sun and start a fire. So they didn't have to eat the lizards raw, but Brian had a digital watch without a crystal, broken at that. So the show didn't help him much. Wait, there was one thing. One of the pilots, a woman, had found some kind of beans on a bush, and she had used them with her lizard meat to make a little stew in a tin can that she had found. Bean lizard stew. There wasn't any beans here, but there must be berries. There had to be berry bushes around. That's what everybody always said. Well, he'd actually never heard anybody say it, but he felt that it should be true. There must be berry bushes. He stood and moved out into the sand and looked up at the sun. It was still high. He didn't know what time it must be. At home, it would be 1 or 2 if the sun were that high. At home, at 1 or 2, his mother would be putting away the lunch dishes and getting ready for her exercise class. No, that would have been yesterday. Today, she would be going to see him. Today was Thursday, and she always went to see him on Thursdays. Wednesday was exercise class, and Thursday she went to see him. Hot little jets of hate worked into his thoughts, pushed once, moved back. If his mother hadn't begun to see him and forced the divorce, Brian wouldn't be here now. He shook his head. Had to stop that kind of thinking. The sun was still high, and that meant that he had some time before darkness to find berries. He didn't want to be away from he almost thought of it as home, shelter, when it came to be dark. He didn't want to be anywhere in the woods when it came to be dark, and he didn't want to get lost, which was a real problem. All he knew in the world was the lake in front of him and the hill at his back and the ridge. If he lost sight of them, there was a really good chance that he would get turned around and not find his way back. So he had to look for berry bushes, but keep the lake or the rock ridge at sight at all times. He looked up the lake shore to the north, and for a good distance before, perhaps 200 yards, it was fairly clear. There were tall pines, the kind with no limbs until very close to the top, with the gentle breeze sighing in them, but not too much low brush. 200 yards up, there seemed to be a belt of thick lower brush starting, about 10 or 12 feet high, and that formed a wall that he could not see. It seemed to go on around the lake, thick and lushly green, but he could not be sure. If there were berries, they would be in the brush, he felt, and as long as he stayed close to the lake, so he could keep the water on the right and know that it was there, he wouldn't get lost. When he was done, or found berries, he thought, he would just turn around so the water was on his left, and walk back until he came to the ridge and his shelter. Simple. Keep it simple. I am Brian Robeson. I have been in a plane crash. I am going to find some food, and I am going to find some berries. He walked slowly, still a bit pained in his joints and weak from hunger, up along the side of the lake. The trees were full of birds singing ahead of him in the sun. Some he knew, and some he didn't. He saw a robin and some kind of sparrow and a flock of reddish-orange birds with thick beaks. 20 or 30 of them were sitting in one of the pines. that made much noise and flew away ahead of him when he walked under the tree. He watched them fly, their color a bright slash in solid green, and in this way he found the berries. The birds landed in some taller willow type of undergrowth with wide leaves and started jumping and making noise. At first he was too far away to see what they were doing, but their color drew him, and he moved toward them, keeping the lake in sight on his right, and when he got closer he saw they were eating the berries. He could not believe it was that easy. It was as if the birds had taken him right to the berries. The slender branches went up about 20 feet and were heavy, drooping with clusters of bright red berries. They were half as big as grapes, but hung in bunches, much like grapes. And when Brian saw them glistening red in the sunlight, he almost yelled. His pace quickened, and he was in them in moments, scattering the birds, grabbing branches, stripping them to fill his mouth with berries. He almost spit them out. It wasn't that they were bitter so much as they lacked any sweetness and had a tart flavor that left his mouth dry feeling. And they were like cherries in that they had large pits, which made them hard to chew. But there was such a hunger on him, such an emptiness, that he could not stop, and kept stripping branches and eating berries by the handful, grabbing and jamming them into his mouth and swallowing them, pits and all. Top of page 60. He could not stop, and when at last his stomach was full, he was still hungry. 2 days without food must have shrunken his stomach, but the drive of hunger was still there. Thinking of the birds and how they would come back into the berries when he left, he made a carrying pouch of his torn windbreaker and kept picking. Finally, when he judged that he had close to 4 pounds in the jacket, he stopped and went back to his camp by the ridge. Now, he thought, now I have some food and I can do something about fixing this place up. He glanced at the sun and he saw that he had some time before dark. If only I had matches, he thought, looking ruefully at the beach and the lakeside. There was driftwood everywhere, not to mention dead and dry wood all over the hill, and dead, dry branches hanging from every tree. All firewood and no matches. How did they use to do it? He thought. Rub 2 sticks together? He tucked the berries in the pouch, back in under the overhang in the cool shade, and found a couple of sticks. After 10 minutes of rubbing, he felt the sticks, and they were almost cool to the touch. Now that, he thought, they didn't do fire that way. He threw the sticks down in disgust. So no fire? But he could still fix the shelter and make it. Here the word safer came into his mind, and he didn't know why, more livable. Kind of close it in, he thought. I'll close it in a bit. He started dragging sticks up from the lake and pulling long dead branches down from the hill, never getting out of sight of the water in the ridge. With these he interlaced and wove a wall across the opening of the front of the rock. It took over 2 hours, and he had to stop several times because he still felt a bit weak, and once because he felt a strange new twinge in his stomach, a tightening and rolling. Too many berries, he thought. I ate too many of them. But it was gone soon, and he kept working until the entire front of the overhang was covered, save for a small opening at the right end nearest the lake. The doorway was about 3 feet, and when he went in, he found himself in a room almost 15 feet long and 8 to 10 feet deep, with a rock wall slope down at the rear. Good, he said, nodding. Good. Outside, the sun was going down, finally, and in the initial coolness, the mosquitoes came out again and clouded in on him. They were thick, terrible, if not quite as bad as the morning, and he kept brushing them off his arms until he couldn't stand it, and then dumped the berries and put the torn windbreaker on. At least the sleeves covered his arms. Wrapped in the jacket, with darkness coming down fast now, he crawled back in under the rock and huddled and tried to sleep. He was deeply tired and still aching some, but sleep was slow coming and did not finally settle in until the evening cool turned to night cool and the mosquitoes slowed. Then at last, with his stomach turning on the berries, Brian went to sleep. Okay, go ahead and add a few more facts to your Google Doc And we're going to stop there for today, Team Alabama. Have a great rest of your day.